Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Mark Hefner. I'm the landowner advisor for Braun and Gresham and Plateau Land and Wildlife Management. And thank you for some of those. I believe I recognize some of the names. Thank you all for those that are coming back. Owning rural land in Texas has its challenges. And with Braun and Gresham and Plateau Land and Wildlife on your side, you've got the best in the business. Any of the unique situations that you may encounter or have to deal with, and that's some of what we'll be covering today. They can certainly assist you in those efforts. I would like to introduce Joanne Hatton, attorney and counselor, as well as David Braun, attorney and counselor. They're going to be presenting today. We have a bit of an interesting situation. David has a commitment, and it's an important one. He needs to be off at 12:30. So we're going to do our best to get through the material by 12:30. And normally we would have open Q&A with you real time. We're going to ask that you either write down your questions, submit them through the Q&A at the bottom. Typically it actually says Q&A. You can type in your questions, and then we're going to address the questions once we're finished with the material. If you have something that needs to be addressed by David Braun, we can assure you that we'll get that to him and David will be able to follow up with you. So you'll lose nothing today. We're just going to have to do it just a little bit different. So thank you for that. Again, feel free to submit questions by Q&A. We're not, and I think Avalon's listening, we're not going to unmute you. We're not going to allow you to speak just because of the time crunch. But please, let me reiterate that we're going to be here to answer all those questions, and then I'm going to shush and introduce, I believe Joanne's going to get us started. Thanks, Joanne.
Hi, thanks so much, Mark. And thanks for that introduction. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about tools to limit your risk and to protect your land. And in working with landowners, we've seen so many situations where landowners could have avoided problems by anticipating and carefully managing their risk. And today we're going to talk about some of the tools that are available to landowners to manage their recreational properties and to protect their other assets. We'll cover the reasons why land poses a special risk and needs special risk management. Two big concerns of owning land and some of the best ways to protect that land, some of the best layers of protection. First, land needs special risk management. We all know Texans love their land. It's very special to them because land is not like other assets. Land can be the most valuable and the most valued asset that a family owns.
And Joanne, I wanted to just personally apologize to everybody and say that it's a doctor's appointment I had to take, and I appreciate everybody's understanding. I also want to add that this idea of land being special is supported by a really interesting study, national study that documented so many landowners feel like passing their land to the next generation is a way of communicating their values and keeping families tied together. So it's not like other assets. When we do risk management, asset protection from land, we're actually working at an emotional level with the bonds that bring families together.
Right. And unlike other types of assets, such as stocks, bonds, mutual funds, bank accounts, recreational land often comes with inherent dangers. And even with the best of intentions, landowners can't always protect their guests or prevent their guests from making dangerous mistakes. So in our discussion today, we'll talk a little bit about the kinds of activities that can create liability and the kinds of steps landowners might take to minimize that risk and to protect this asset that is very valuable to them and part of their family heritage. Protecting recreational land is much different than the way most of us protect our home or our car with just insurance. There are many ways risk can manifest itself on recreational property, and there are a number of tools available to help minimize that risk. There is not one single solution. And we like to think about it as layers of protection.
Joanne, let me just
Go ahead.
I'm just going to jump in there and say it's a personal choice how many of these layers you want to choose. Some people just want the basics. Some people want to have a very solid wall. It's it's a customized for each family, each piece of land.
Sure. And some tools are easy and quick and inexpensive, and some are complicated. And we look at each situation individually and help landowners to decide how many layers of protection they need. And it's possible and practical in many cases to kind of set those up over time so that the most important pieces, the most important bricks are there, and we can add to that protection as you use your land for more dangerous activities or have more guests or your use of your land changes.
Or I might mention your assets increase as
Absolutely.
clients become wealthier, there's more to protect.
Right, absolutely. And there are two, and in a broad sense, there are two big concerns of owning land. The first is an accident on the land itself. Texans use their recreational land for hunting, swimming, riding ATVs, horseback riding, and all of these things have inherent risks. But the biggest risk we see is when urban friends or family or people just unfamiliar with these types of activities come to visit. And people are often handed the keys to ATVs or put on horses or around animals without being instructed of safety protocols. And this can lead to accidents and unforeseen events. And the second concern where we see, or the second way we see liability threaten a family's recreational land is where there is a personal or business financial setback, such as a bankruptcy or a divorce, a medical emergency, death, disability, creditors, and we can help use those layers of protection we talked about around your property so that there's less exposure of loss from these kinds of unforeseen events. And today we'll talk about some of the best layers of protection. And some of the best layers of protection that we use are to create a business entity. And while many Texans own property in their own name, and while that can be cost efficient and simple, to put something into an LLC or a family limited partnership, trust can also be used. Not every family needs that expense or that complication of managing a business entity or trust, but for the right situation, it can be an excellent tool to protect you. And the other, business entities can serve different purposes, and I'll let David chime in on this.
Yeah, the nice thing about using a LLC or a trust is not only are you limiting liability, those tools have real value in estate planning to help transfer the property to the next generation. They also give families a structure and a rule book for management decisions. You know, as families grow and there's many generations involved with the property, it becomes increasingly difficult to make decisions, and putting the property in a LLC gives you a chance to set up the rules. It also helps you prevent fragmentation, as some family members might come or go through divorce, for example. Now, so I think we've covered this, Joanne, but Braun and Gresham would work with a client to choose the best entity, and it might be in an entity that's based in another state. Every state has different laws about these entities. So we'll help you choose an entity. We'll design it for your family and your land, deed the property into the entity, and then even give you guidance on how to manage this new company or trust.
And another layer of protection are the statutory limitations on liability. Texas has a number of statutes on the books to limit landowners' liability against lawsuits when they're sued, particularly by guests. But there are a few things landowners must do in order to qualify for those statutory protections. And at Braun and Gresham, we can do a quick review of those steps with landowners to be sure they're meeting the statutory requirements for those protections. Some of the items that help, and I'll let David talk about those, but signage, having the right type of insurance. And if you don't have those requirements met, you can fall into a spot where you're not protected by the statutes that were enacted to protect you.
Yeah, exactly. And there are several different statutes, Joanne. And so it's where people miss the opportunity to use these statutes is knowing the specifics of the large farm animal statute. If you have horses or even cattle on your land and you bring guests in, there's certain basic things you have to screen the guests before you let them ride the horse to make sure that they have the knowledge and physical fitness. If you put an inexperienced person on a horse, you're not protected by the liability statute. You have to do regular checkups of your equipment, of faulty stirrup or rein, and you lose the protection of the statute. And finally, there's some signage we like to see people post. I think that's the next slide. Yeah, this is a statutorily mandated slide. This particular one might be from another state, but there is a specific sign that you need to have posted in your stable. And if you don't have it, your liability protection is limited. So I think we've covered this. We're gonna help people review the operations on their property, make sure they have the right equipment, the signage, and know with some confidence that the statute, which was intended to protect you from lawsuits, is actually effective.
And another place that we can help is with insurance review. Insurance is the most common tool for modern risk protection. Most people have insurance on their property anyway. It's usually required it is required if you have a mortgage on your property most of the time. But knowing what your insurance policy actually covers and whether you shopped for the right insurance types of coverage can be crucial. Many times people find out after it's too late that their insurance policy doesn't cover what they thought it would. Sometimes landowners realize after they've had accidents on their land that their insurance doesn't cover accidents related to things like hunting.
Yeah, and also the amount of insurance you carry needs to be selected so that it meets those minimum statutory requirements and also is effective for the net worth of your family. So we see over and over again that the best intentioned real estate agents don't go into that depth. Not real estate, excuse me, insurance agents don't go into enough depth. They don't understand the connections to the statutory rules, and they're not asking you about the activities on your land. Yeah, the horseback riding, hunting are often excluded from basic policies. So we can recommend companies that will cover rural land activities.
And another one of those bricks of protection, those layers of protection, is your homestead protection. Texas has some of the most powerful homestead protections in the country, and it's important to take and to know how to take full advantage of those protections. And there are different types of homestead protection, and I'll let David go ahead and talk about those.
Yeah, this is a little trap that catches people all the time, because there's a homestead protection that you have to designate when you claim your property for tax purposes. But that is a different kind of homestead than liability homestead. And if you don't distinguish, if you don't file the right paperwork, you can lose a lot of the liability protection by letting the tax homestead become the default. So and there's no one at the tax office explaining the difference to you. They just tell you you have to choose, and you're limited to 20 acres. Well, that's not true. You may qualify for up to 200 acres of protection, but you have to file different paperwork.
Exactly. And as David just said, you want to determine the extent of the protection for which you qualify. And another way that we can help is waivers of liability and releases. The kind of waiver you sign, liability waivers are that kind of waiver you sign when you send your kid off to camp. Some people think that they're not worth much anymore. The law has changed a little bit, but we believe they are useful in a lot of cases. They still have a place. A waiver can be very useful for reasons beyond just liability protection. It can educate your guests and put them on notice of the dangers of certain activities. It becomes a lot more real to people when they're signing a form than when you're just telling them that something is dangerous.
Yeah, so the thing that makes a waiver of liability work is how customized it is. And so again, including information about the actual activities on your land, and so that everything's real, not fine print or boilerplate, that makes it more effective. If you just give people a standard form to sign and it's a bunch of fine print, those get thrown out all the time. But one that's custom crafted for your property so that people know the risk they're accepting, that makes all the difference.
Right. And the next layer we're going to talk about is lease agreements and limiting your liability through your lease agreements, whether those are grazing leases, oil and gas leases, or wind and solar. There can be a number of indemnity provisions integrated into those agreements to protect you. And so if those agreements are properly drafted, they can lower your risk as well as providing you income. And if they're poorly drafted, they lead to more risk and generally more disputes between you and your lessees.
And I just had this experience this week, Joanne, where a client was letting a potential buyer of their property come on the land and kind of look around, kick the tires, do some, have some contractors in to look at things, but they weren't under any kind of contract yet. And that was a major missed opportunity to have everyone sign off on the buyer was coming at their own risk and that they were being allowed on the property for their purposes. That just would have been, if some of those contractors had been injured, it's just been an unfortunate missed opportunity. So every one of those hunting leases, grazing leases, they're an opportunity to define who's responsible and who bears the liability.
Sure. And then we want to talk about training, instruction, and protocols. If you're the kind of landowner who has a lot of people out to your land, if you have scouting groups, church groups, or if you entertain a lot, or even a little bit, it's useful to develop some training or protocols for your guests. As we said earlier, a lot of people go out to rural property visitors who don't have experience with ATVs or guns or horses or farm animals. And of course, landowners don't want to just make their guests afraid. They don't want their experience to be all about fear. And it is not all about liability, but you can offer some basic instruction and protect your guests as best you can. They're your friends, they're people you care about. It's worth doing. So take the time to educate your guests, develop specific training for common activities that you do. If you're going to hand somebody a gun, make sure they know how to use it.
Yeah, the best programs, Joanne, really make it about having the guests have a good time. And so when guests arrive, talk to them about, you want them to enjoy themselves, you want them to be able to fully utilize the land and the opportunity. But to do that, you need to make sure they understand and that they're capable. So that, taking 30 minutes or an hour before drinks are served is a great time to orient your guests and make sure that they're going to have a great time. And people appreciate that you're responsible. It's not just sticking a waiver in front of them and asking them to sign away their rights. It's not about that.
Right. Exactly. And also, in addition to that, we can give inspection recommendations. There are dangers on your rural land, like we just talked about, and you and your family might be used to those. And a trained eye might help you see these dangers in a different way. So you can take steps to avoid needless accidents. When we're talking about guests and people who are not familiar, it's different than you and your family who are out on your property every day. And making things a bit more safe can be pretty easy. Regular inspections are helpful, and and they're recommended. No one wants to see a needless accident because something hasn't been inspected or checked on it or isn't safe.
So Braun and Gresham's role in this is really to help you start down this path. Obviously, you don't need a lawyer to inspect your property, but thinking about when and how often and how it interacts with your liability, that's the role Braun and Gresham plays, and connecting you with qualified people. every property is different. You know, the stable comes to mind. There've been some recent cases with horse injuries, and we know a lot more about what a landowner should be doing to provide a safe experience for their guests. Waterfront activities, another place where drownings can occur and the landowner can take some really basic steps to protect their guests.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also to have, in the event of an accident, to have emergency protocols, be prepared. You don't want to start looking for the closest hospital that can treat a snake bite after one of your friends or relatives is bit by a snake. You want to know beforehand. Developing emergency protocols can help you. If you face an emergency or a bad situation, it's very helpful to already know what you're going to do. And so, yeah, we can help you with that.
Yeah, snake bite's a great example. Not every hospital carries anti-venom. You need to get a snake bite victim within an hour to a place where they have anti-venom on hand. The difference could be losing a limb. Same with knowing how to get a life flight into your property. If you don't already know where there's a helicopter life flight and registered with them so they know where to come to your property, you're missing an opportunity to handle an emergency better. You should know the phone number to call, and they should already know where your property is when you call.
And I'm just going to recap real quick and say that all of these things can be helpful. And again, we look at each situation individually and help landowners to decide how many layers of protection they need to protect themselves, their assets, and their land based on their individual concerns and their budget. And so there's one more thing I'd like to add that wasn't in our slide today, but the other thing I'd like to add about risk protection is that you want to make sure to classify your employees correctly, not to misclassify employees as independent contractors. There's been recent case law that that makes it clear that you can put yourself at a lot more risk if you're classifying employees as independent contractors. So that's one thing. But the bottom line is, yeah, that we look at each individual situation separately and we help you to decide how many layers of protection you need, what you need. We look at your individual budget and your individual concerns, and we craft a plan to suit your needs.
And those are very personal conversations, Joanne. It's we pride ourselves on being counselors and advisors. I was working with a client recently who, after a couple of hours discussion, she felt comfortable saying, you know, one of my kids has got an alcohol problem, and I can't put all the family's assets at risk because of that one. And I've got another one who's probably going to go through a divorce. So I want to plan for both of those things. That's the level at which we can really help families do the best job. If we know where some of your weak spots are, so to speak.
Exactly, exactly. And so, you know, here's a slide that shows a number of our services. We do a whole lot for rural landowners, and we help them in a variety of ways. I think we're going to, instead of finishing up the way we usually were, I think we're going to open this up for questions if we have any.
We haven't had any typed in, so we'll reiterate to the audience that they can begin asking questions. Avalon, I believe if they want to unmute themselves, they can go ahead and respond as well, correct?
I will give them that permission now, Mark. So y'all should see in just a second a little microphone show up on your Zoom screen. And it probably will have an X through it right now, but if you click that microphone, it will unmute you and you can just ask your questions directly.
And if you don't have, and if you don't, again, if you don't want to speak, you can ask a Q&A. We're getting a couple of questions now. One thing I did want to mention, these are being recorded. So let me go in here now. Joanne and David, y'all probably can't see those. So I'm just going to start from the top. Could you explain the independent contractors and workers and how workers' comp comes into play?
Sure. If I believe the way it works is that if you classify somebody as an independent contractor, there is no coverage for workers' compensation, and your insurance policy may not cover employees. So what can happen is you think you have an independent contractor, your insurance company will say, under the law, you really had an employee and you are not signed up for the workman's comp. You're not eligible for it because you haven't been paying into it. This person isn't an employee as far as the state. And so you lose those coverages that would have otherwise protected you, and you yourself become liable and at risk. And so it is important to not misclassify. If you're telling somebody how to do their job, when to show up, and you're giving them the tools to do their job, and they're clearly not an independent contractor, then it is important to make sure that you classify them as an employee and you treat them as an employee, because you can end up in a space where they're not covered under the protections that are there for employees, and they're not covered and they're excluded as employees under your insurance. And the insurance company will say they are technically employees, even if you didn't treat them that way. They were employees, so they're excluded.
Okay, fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
To that attendee, if we didn't completely answer, please feel free to add some additional details. Question was, would you please talk more about hunting guests? And this could be something I can relate to our property in Mason County. I bring friends, family, mainly the ones I would think would be at risk were friends that come to hunt. You mentioned a little bit about actually training them, putting some guidelines in place, kind of what I do now. But all the question says, would you please talk more about hunting guests? To that attendee, if you have more specifics, let us know. I don't know if David or Joanne had anything more to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just say the big problem we see is that longtime Texans are familiar from childhood with firearms and hunting, and a lot of things go unsaid. But as more and more people move to the state, live in urban areas, you just can't rely on those assumptions. So you actually have to ask your guests how much they've hunted, what kind of training they've had, really basic things. I'm going to give an example. I was invited to a client's land who was a almost sniper level shooter, had a massive range set up, and I was invited out at the same time as a banker. He asked us to start shooting these rifles at targets 800 yards away, just because we're all guys. But I was comfortable and experienced enough to go along, but the banker had never shot a rifle before. And he put his eye up to the scope and left his eye there when he fired, and the kick of the rifle cut his eye. We had to take him to get stitches. That was just silly. There should have been a discussion. The banker shouldn't have pretended that he knew how to shoot, but the landowner should have asked too. And he could have easily lost an eye. So that would be the kind of thing we're talking about.
Good point. Don't make assumptions on their level of expertise. And then I've even gone so far as, at least at my property, make them actually shoot in front of me so I can see their accuracy. Because if you're shooting targets is one thing, but if they're actually hunting, then there's also the ethical thing about wounding animals. And so that's great feedback, David, and great things that a lot of people wouldn't think about, because a lot of men, and not just men, I suppose, but a lot of men and women won't ask, what their level of comfortable or comfort is when it comes to handling a weapon.
So I see Glenn ask a follow-up question, and I should have said it. Yes, the waiver of liability that we would recommend is that your guest initial a clause that says their experience and they accept responsibility. They know firearms, and that so the waiver is very specific.
Excellent. Thank you, David. All right, so David's reading some of those. Does Braun and Gresham have any experience with non-annexation development agreements?
Not the lawyers on the phone, but we have, and unless Joanne's done something recently I don't know about, but we have been involved in annexation agreements many times. My partner, Cassie Gresham, has been through it with many clients and changes in the law. We were involved in the legislature when those laws were changing. So yes, we can get you to the right person, Rick.
Excellent. And the last one, y'all feel free to keep asking questions. David's going to jump off whenever he needs to. The last one we have so far is, how does forming an LLC interact with the Texas homestead law?
Well, there's really, you only get to claim one place as your homestead, and it's such an excellent tool. You kind of have to choose. You have to look at the properties you own. You may have a house in the city. You may have a ranch. There's really kind of one chance to use that homestead. And the other properties might go in an LLC, but then there's considerations to the extent you put something. An LLC cannot have a homestead, so you can't overlap them. And then to the extent that you use homestead on property, you may, in some counties, you may not be able to qualify for ag or wildlife without a conversation. So I guess the answer is there's a kind of a pros and cons on when to use homestead and when to use an LLC.
Okay.
And I'll add that it depends how much property you have, because that homestead protection, while it can protect a whole lot of land, we get up to 200 acres. And if you have more than that, then the homestead is limited there to 200 acres. So.
Yeah. Sometimes sometimes it's just not worth using the homestead. It's too inflexible, and we'll just go with the LLC. It also depends on the wealth in the rest of your life. Is your land your biggest asset? Where's your risk coming from? Homestead protects you from all creditors except a mortgagee or a tax creditor. But an LLC, that doesn't protect the land itself. If the land is an asset of the LLC and the risk is coming from the land, then LLC may not be the best tool. Now we're really getting boring and sounding like lawyers now.
Right, right.
Well, what you're saying to some of these questions is it depends on their particular situation. So that's where, Joanne, if you want to flip to at least maybe go to the LIS real quick. I think it was the next slide, just to let people know signing up for this newsletter is a great deal for you. It keeps you in touch not only with Braun and Gresham, but you're going to get some of the latest access to the best news, the best information, the most recent development. So this is a great opportunity to sign up and stay connected to Braun and Gresham, and then go ahead and go to the contact page. Maybe. Did it not go? There we go. So what David and Joanne are willing to do is speak with you. And this is not a big engagement. They're not gonna send you a bill for $1,000, but feel free to reach out to us if you've just got some really particular questions. But I can assure you the landowners that I work with and introduced to Joanne and David, for instance, they're so happy. They feel like they finally got to that person that can help them. So please don't hesitate. And I'm looking at our questions to ask questions today, but you have our direct connection to them and as well as to me. If you're not quite ready to speak to an attorney, you are more than welcome to call me. I work with landowners all over the state as well for various ways. And then we can discuss what it would look like as a next step for you guys. Do we have any more after that, Joanne, or is that the last slide?
I think that might be the last one.
Okay.
That's it. That's what we got.
All right. So we've got all the questions answered. If we don't have any more, we can start to shut it down. I can't thank the attendees enough for sticking around with us. We're going to send you a link with the recording that you can share, actually, if you have family members or other connections that you want to share it with. Again, please don't hesitate to call or email. I will reach out to you as well. David and Joanne, thank you guys. Do y'all have any closing words or are y'all good?
I think we're good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it was a pleasure to be with everybody today, and the miracle of modern technology means that we can actually quickly get together and not have to, have you come to the office or go to the ranch, though we always like to visit your ranch.
All right. Thank you, guys. And thanks, everyone, for your attendance. And look forward to seeing you again on another webinar.
Thank you.